We've noticed this in previous studies that in a healthy church, it is not uncommon to have believers who are mature, believers that are maturing. We're all maturing, but those who are really learning and they're starting to move, and those who are new to the faith and struggling. And there are things that are issues for one person that aren't issues for another. And how we handle those in the assembly really affects the way we get along. And Pastor Tim Holstrom, we're looking at getting along, what it means for us as believers to get along, how God has made it possible for us to get along. And we have been just kind of surveying through the New Testament, and we are now in Romans chapter 14. Romans 14 says, verse 1, and this is from the 2020 edition of the New American Standard. It says, now accept or receive the one who is weak in faith. And I wouldn't say weak in faith, it's weak in the faith. Now, the faith, different than faith. Faith is an attitude, a quality that you have. But when you have, over here in the Greek, the faith, he's talking about something very specific. And it's not just doctrine. Now, a lot of times we look at the faith as the doctrine. It's the faith that the church holds to. No. The faith is the collection of specific promises, because faith always, for it to be valid, it has to have a promise from God. Faith is never just in static facts. So when it's talking here about the faith, it's talking about the fact that God has made specific promises to you and I as believers that make up our Christian life. He's made us promises about how we can set our minds to who we are in Christ and enjoy this filling ministry of the Spirit, how we can walk by the Spirit and not fulfill the lust of the flesh, how we can put on the armor of God and Satan will flee from us, how we can actually choose to love believers and not love God, how God can do works of love through us for other believers. And those are just a beginning of that. I did a study on that in our church here a number of years back, and I don't know. By reading through the New Testament letters that were written to the churches, I tallied up well over 100 promises. And I'm sure I came far short of all the promises that are there. And they don't all have the word promise. Sometimes just God says, do this and this happens. Do this and I will do this. That's a promise. But there's some that are weak in the faith, and there's things that they don't know. For instance, if we go back to chapter 8 in Romans, there are two statements over there. One tells us that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of Christ, the one who is interceding for us. It says just a few verses before that. And then just a couple verses later, it tells us, and nothing can separate us from the love of God, which is to us in Christ Jesus. In other words, nothing can get God to stop saying that we're in Christ and saying those good things about us. So nothing can get Christ to stop interceding for us, and nothing can get the Father to stop counting us to be in Christ. Those are verses for eternal security, plain and simple. But not all believers understand or appreciate that. Yeah, I've known many believers that they love that last verse. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. But they still think that they can lose their salvation. Or maybe they've lost their salvation. Or if they don't think they can lose their salvation, they can think in some way that their salvation is harmed or damaged by what they do, so that they're just going to continually and probably even into eternity always be a little on the outs with God. They'll make it to heaven. God will say welcome, but please go stand at the back of the line. And they may not express it that way, but that's what they have in mind. So he says, you receive even those who are weak in the faith. You don't tell people you can only come to our church after you've matured, after you've learned the promises and demonstrated that you can actually really appreciate God's promises for you. No, you don't do that. And he says, receive them, but not to quarrels over opinions. And in the Greek has disputations or doubts about doubtful things. So you got these debates over these things that you're battling, talking back and about. Verse 2. One person has faith that he made all things, but one who is weak eats only vegetables. No, he's not a vegetarian because he loves animals or something like that. He's a vegetarian because he thinks that if he eats meat, there's a good chance that he is going to be participating in idol worship. Now, in the city of Rome, there were multiple temples to these false gods around the city. And in nearly every one of those temples on a daily basis, or in every one of those temples on a daily basis, there were people that were bringing sacrifices to those gods. And so let's say there's a man that has a goat, and he takes that goat down to that temple, and he sacrifices it. He gets to take some of the meat now and sell it in the marketplace that day, and the priest burns some of it, and the priest probably, maybe like Israel's priests, got to eat some himself. He takes and sells it in the marketplace, and you as a Roman that is now a believer in Jesus Christ, you come along and you go, how do I know that this meat that is being sold here at this market was not offered to the God that I used to offer incense and sacrifices to? I'm not going to eat that because I might be eating meat offered to that idol. And if I eat meat offered to that idol, it might cause God to not love me or cause me in some way to have my salvation damaged. So this is why some are vegetarians. But those that are strong in the faith, they're looking at this and they like, I can eat anything. They understand, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, idols are nothing. They're false gods. They're not real. And so he says in verse 3, the one who eats is not to regard, with contempt, the one who does not eat. So if you are mature in the faith, you don't look down your nose and go, you're still struggling with those problems. Yeah, you don't do that. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who does eat, for God has accepted him. You're not supposed to look at them and go, I can't eat. What are you doing eating that meat? God's going to judge you for that. God, you're going to be in trouble because you're eating meat offered to idols, maybe. Because you didn't know that for sure, but there was a really, really good chance that most of the meat in the marketplaces had been sacrificed to idols. He's telling both sides on here. Treat the other side well. Don't get into debates. Don't argue with these people. Don't make them feel bad that they're stuck eating vegetables at the present time because they haven't matured enough to not worry about the meat. And if people are eating meat, he says, back off. That's okay. If you want to eat meat, if you don't want to eat meat, you want to just eat vegetables, that's fine. But don't judge them. God accepts them. You're not the judge. Verse 3, who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. And then I love this statement at the end. We'd look at that and go, yeah, and some of them are going to fall. No, he says, and he will stand. He will stand. And he just says, and in fact, in the Hebrew, or excuse me, in the Greek, this word stand over here is a future passive. In other words, it just doesn't he stand because, well, he's strong. It says he's made to stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So the Lord actively makes him stand, but he will be made to stand. I think that the English translation could reflect this a little bit better. That's God's job to make a person stand. Nobody's going to reach and come before God in the future and stand there because they did everything right. Every last one of us, because of our salvation is by grace, past, present, and future, we are all going to stand there because we're made to stand by him because salvation ultimately is his work. I work out my salvation, but salvation is his work, beginning to end. A lot of people just make it salvation, God's work at the beginning. Sanctification is our work. No, even that is a process that God is actually the one working us through that. And finally, when our salvation is ended, God does that also. He uses another example. One person values one day over another. In other words, probably people that are of a Jewish background, they still think they should maybe keep a Sabbath day. And the Sabbath, by the way, is not Sunday. It's still Saturday. It's just that is for a person that doesn't understand what's happening today, that there is no one specific day left anymore that we keep. Because he says another values every day the same. This is the mark of maturity. The mature believer really has every day is the same. The immature believer thinks, I have to keep a special day of the week, which at their time was focusing on Saturday, what we would call Saturday, because that was the Jewish Sabbath, and they thought that that should still be kept special. Today, and I grew up with this background, that Sunday was our special day. And because of that, we should treat Sunday like Sabbath. But every day in reality is the same. But remember, this is a matter of maturity and a matter of understanding these promises. And so each person must be fully convinced in his mind. Notice Paul doesn't come in either sense and he goes, hey, you guys that are worried about the meat, quit fussing over it. You're good. It's all grace. Come on. Or these guys, you guys are still fussing about the Sabbath day. It's done. The law's over, which he's already established, by the way, in the book of Romans. But he doesn't do that to them. What does he say? Each one has to be fully convinced in his own mind. He allows these people to have the liberty or freedom to decide in themselves where they are. Paul knows God is going to grow these people. I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in the lives of other people, that things that were issues at one point, as you mature, become non-issues. All of a sudden you're like, I don't even remember exactly when I changed, but I really don't have a problem with that anymore. And I've watched that in multiple other people's lives. He says the one who observes a day, he observes it to the Lord. And the one who eats, well, he does so with regard to the Lord. He who gives thanks, for he gives thanks to God. And the one who does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat, and he also gives thanks. It's not like one person gives thanks and the other one doesn't. So for no one of us lives to himself, no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. And that's true for every last one of us, no matter where we are in these issues. We'll stop there. We've got more to see in this chapter. But at this point, and it's always interesting, if you're with believers, you might ask them, what are some things that you think are issues that kind of can divide Christians like this? I mean, for them, it was, should you keep Sabbath or not keep Sabbath anymore? Should you eat meat offered to idols or not? That's not even an issue for us. When was the last time you were someplace where you were worried that the meat had been offered to an idol? But we have issues. We have things in our culture. We have things that are going on that Christians, that there isn't a specific right or wrong. Yeah, there are things in our culture that there's specific right and wrongs. Don't get me wrong on that. I'm not saying that everything can vary back and forth, but how you respond to some of things in culture, there are some opportunities for us to make different decisions, to choose and think differently. I hope you understand, appreciate that. And whatever side you're on, whether you're on the side that you're still very sensitive about some of these things, or whether you're on the side where you're like, oh, God's matured me. I don't have a problem with that anymore. Paul's point is, there's a right way to look at your brother. And if you're mature enough that these things don't bother you, you don't look down at him with contempt. You don't despise him. You just remember, God matured you. He's in the process of maturing those believers. If you're the person, on the other hand, that's still struggling with some issues, there's some things you think, I don't think Christians should be eating that stuff. I don't think they should. I don't think that they should be going there. Whatever that might be, you need to, with those people, not judge them. To realize they stand before God. God judges them. And in reality, God's going to make all of us stand. Nobody's going to fall. We will fall in honor to him, but no one is going to get before him and then fall and collapse in misery and pain because, I told them they shouldn't have been eating meat off the idols or whatever it is. By the way, without arguing with people, if you have believers where you are, one of the things that I've done when I've gone over this passage is I've asked the people in our Bible studies, hey, what are some things we have today? It's interesting to have people tally up lists of things that people struggle with. And just be aware, because sometimes people are going to mention things you're going, I wouldn't have thought of that. But those are issues that people are dealing with today in our churches in the midst of this culture. With all of that, remember, there's a proper way to relate to each other, because ultimately we are God's work, salvation is God's work, and we're both brothers and sisters in Christ as the objects of that work. And we should appreciate that, looking both directions. Have a good day in the Lord, And as always, thank you for joining me.